Once upon a time, millions of American kitchens trusted a single name, Betty Crocker. Her recipes filled tables, shaped family traditions, and turned simple ingredients into comfort that felt like home. But not all of those dishes survived. Some quietly disappeared, left behind in faded cookbooks and forgotten memories. Strange combinations, once celebrated, are now barely remembered. Tonight, we step back into that lost world to uncover 10 Betty Crocker recipes that time slowly erased and ask the question, why did they vanish from American tables forever? Stay with us as these forgotten flavors return from the past one by one again. It began with a dish that looked more like a centerpiece than something meant to be eaten. Tomato aspic salad once held a proud place on American tables, especially from the 1940s through the 1960s. Made from tomato juice, gelatin, and a mix of finely chopped vegetables, it was poured into decorative molds and left to set into a firm, glistening shape. When unmolded, it carried an almost jewel-like shine, often served cold on crisp lettuce leaves with a dollop of mayonnaise on the side. At the time, this wasn't considered unusual. Gelatin dishes were a symbol of effort and elegance, showing that time had been spent preparing something special. Families brought these salads to gatherings, potlucks, and holiday meals, where presentation mattered just as much as taste. There was a quiet pride in slicing into something so carefully crafted. But beneath its polished appearance was a flavor and texture that slowly fell out of favor. The cold, savory gelatin combined with vegetables created a contrast that newer generations struggled to enjoy. As cooking styles shifted toward fresher, simpler foods, dishes like tomato aspic salad began to feel outdated, even unsettling to some. By the late 1970s, it had mostly vanished from everyday kitchens. What was once a sign of sophistication became a curious relic, remembered more for its appearance than its taste. Yet, for those who grew up with it, this dish still carries echoes of family tables, carefully set, where even the strangest creations were served with pride and quietly enjoyed together. There was a time when sweet and savory weren't just combined, they were celebrated in ways that now feel almost unthinkable. One of the strangest examples was ham and banana hollandaise, a dish that quietly appeared in mid-century kitchens and carried the full confidence of its era. It began with ripe bananas, peeled and wrapped in slices of baked ham, then covered in a warm, buttery hollandaise sauce. The result was rich, glossy, and undeniably unusual. To the families who served it, this wasn't a joke or a novelty. It represented creativity at a time when home cooks were encouraged to experiment, to surprise guests with something new and unexpected. Cookbooks of the 1950s often leaned into bold combinations, blending convenience with a sense of sophistication. Canned goods, processed meats, and fresh produce were all brought together under the belief that innovation meant progress. Served at dinners or small gatherings, ham and banana hollandaise was meant to impress. The sweetness of the banana softened the saltiness of the ham, while the sauce added a smooth, indulgent finish. For some it worked. For others, it was simply tolerated out of politeness, a dish remembered more for its curiosity than its flavor. As decades passed, tastes became more defined, and the line between sweet and savory grew clearer. What once felt adventurous began to feel confusing, even off-putting. Slowly, this dish disappeared, no longer fitting the expectations of modern tables. Now, it lingers only in old recipe cards, a quiet reminder of a time when the kitchen was a place of fearless experimentation. It arrived at the table with a name that promised something impossible: perfection salad. In the early decades of the 20th century, this shimmering creation was seen as a triumph of modern cooking, even winning praise in recipe contests and appearing in trusted kitchen guides. Made from cabbage, carrots, green peppers, and vinegar, all suspended in a clear lemon-flavored gelatin, it stood tall in carefully shaped molds, glowing under dining room lights. At a time when refrigeration was becoming more common, gelatin dishes symbolized progress. They allowed home cooks to create something structured, decorative, and unlike anything from the past. Perfection salad was more than food. It was proof that the future had arrived in the American kitchen. It was served at luncheons, church gatherings, and family meals, often placed at the center of the table as something to admire before it was eaten. But the experience of eating it told a different story. The crisp vegetables trapped inside a cold, quivering gelatin created a texture that felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. The sharpness of vinegar combined with the sweetness of gelatin left a taste that didn't quite settle. Over time, what was once praised as innovative began to feel confusing. As food culture shifted toward freshness and simplicity, dishes like perfection salad slowly faded. By the 1960s and beyond, it was no longer a staple but a memory. Today, it survives mostly in old cookbooks, a reminder of a moment when perfection meant something very different and when the future of food looked strangely transparent. There was a time when nothing went to waste, and even the most overlooked ingredients were transformed into something meant to nourish a family. Liver loaf with glaze was one of those dishes, humble, practical, and deeply rooted in an era when resourcefulness defined the kitchen. Popular through the 1930s and into the post-war years, it took organ meat, often considered undesirable, and turned it into a structured, sliceable meal. Ground liver was mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and simple seasonings, then shaped into a loaf and baked slowly in the oven. What made it stand out was the glaze brushed over the top, sometimes a blend of ketchup, brown sugar, or vinegar, creating a glossy finish that added a touch of sweetness to an otherwise rich and heavy dish. Served in thick slices, it was often paired with potatoes or canned vegetables, forming a meal that was filling and affordable. For many families, this wasn't just dinner, it was necessity. During hard times, especially around the Great Depression and wartime rationing, every ingredient had value. Dishes like liver loaf reflected a mindset where flavor came second to survival, and creativity was driven by limitation rather than choice. But as prosperity grew and access to a wider variety of meats became easier, tastes began to change. Liver, once accepted without question, developed a reputation many found difficult to embrace. Its strong flavor and dense texture no longer fit the evolving expectations of comfort food. Gradually, liver loaf with glaze disappeared from everyday meals, replaced by dishes that felt lighter and more familiar. Now, it lingers only as a memory of a time when the kitchen was guided by necessity, and even the simplest meals carried the weight of survival and quiet resilience. It often appeared at gatherings in a shape that felt more decorative than edible, carefully unmolded onto a serving plate with quiet anticipation. The tuna noodle ring mold was once a familiar sight in American homes during the 1950s and 1960s, a dish that combined practicality with presentation. Made from egg noodles bound together with eggs and sometimes cheese, it was pressed into a ring-shaped mold and baked until firm. Once turned out onto a plate, the hollow center was filled with a creamy tuna mixture, often made with canned soup and peas. At the time, this dish represented efficiency and creativity. It used affordable pantry staples, relied on canned ingredients for convenience, and still managed to look impressive enough for guests. The ring shape itself gave it a sense of occasion, transforming simple components into something that felt carefully planned and thoughtfully served. For many families, it became a go-to option for potlucks or modest dinner parties. But as visually striking as it was, the experience of eating it didn't always match its appearance. The dense noodle ring, combined with the soft, creamy filling, created a texture that felt heavy and repetitive. Over time, as fresh ingredients became more accessible and cooking styles shifted toward lighter meals, dishes like this began to lose their appeal. By the late 1970s, the tuna noodle ring mold had largely faded from everyday kitchens. What once symbolized ingenuity and modern convenience slowly turned into a relic of a different era, remembered for its unusual shape and the quiet effort behind making something simple feel special. It sat in shimmering silence on the table, often described more as a creation than a meal. Chicken a la king in pastry shells was once a hallmark of mid-century American dining, especially during the 1950s and 1960s when presentation carried as much weight as flavor. Tender pieces of chicken were simmered in a creamy sauce with mushrooms, peas, and sometimes pimentos, then carefully spooned into delicate pastry shells that had been baked until golden and crisp. This dish was never meant to feel casual. It belonged to a time when home cooking was deeply influenced by elegance and aspiration. Inspired by restaurant-style dining, it brought a sense of occasion into ordinary homes. Serving it meant attention had been paid, not just to taste, but to form, balance, and appearance. The contrast between the flaky pastry and the rich, creamy filling made it feel almost refined, like something served in a quiet dining room with polished silverware. Yet behind its polished image was a recipe that required patience and coordination. The sauce had to be smooth, the chicken tender, and the pastry shells intact enough to hold everything together. It was impressive, but not always practical for everyday meals. As lifestyles became faster and cooking time shortened, elaborate dishes like this began to feel less necessary. Gradually, chicken a la king in pastry shells slipped out of regular rotation. New generations favored simpler, quicker meals that didn't require multiple steps or careful presentation. Today, it remains a quiet reminder of a time when even a weeknight dinner could be dressed up, and when effort in the kitchen was seen as its own form of hospitality. There was a quiet, almost ceremonial feeling to the way it was served, set in a glass bowl, chilled until perfectly firm, and unmolded with care. Jellied consommé was once considered a refined dish in American households, especially during the mid-20th century when gelatin-based recipes were seen as modern and sophisticated. Made from clarified beef or chicken broth, carefully seasoned and then set with gelatin, it created a clear, trembling dish that often held suspended pieces of vegetables, herbs, or finely diced meat. To many home cooks of the era, this wasn't strange, it was elegant. Clear soups and molded dishes were associated with precision and culinary skill. Preparing consommé required time and attention, as the broth had to be clarified until almost crystal clear before it could be transformed into its final form. Once set, it was often served at formal dinners or special occasions, sometimes accompanied by crackers or a light salad. But even then, reactions were divided. While some admired its appearance, others found the texture unusual and the concept of a cold, gelatinized soup difficult to embrace. As tastes evolved and comfort foods shifted toward warmth and simplicity, dishes like jellied consommé began to lose their place at the table. By the 1970s, it had largely disappeared from everyday menus, surviving mostly in vintage cookbooks and memory. What once represented refinement and culinary precision slowly became a curiosity from another time. Today, it stands as a reminder of an era when food wasn't just about nourishment, but about transformation, turning even something as simple as broth into a carefully crafted, almost artistic experience. There was a time when dessert didn't always mean something light or simple. It could be playful, surprising, and sometimes even confusing by today's standards. Mock apple pie is one of the most famous examples of that era. Popularized during times when fresh fruit was expensive or limited, especially in the 1930s and wartime years, this recipe promised the flavor of apples without using a single apple. Instead, it relied on crushed crackers, often saltines, cooked with sugar, water, lemon juice, and cream of tartar. As it simmered, the crackers softened and took on a texture that was surprisingly similar to cooked apples. Once poured into a pie crust and baked, it was meant to imitate the taste, aroma, and comfort of traditional apple pie. For many families, this wasn't seen as deception, it was ingenuity. It reflected a time when home cooks were constantly adapting, making desserts out of whatever was available, and stretching ingredients as far as possible. Cookbooks even encouraged it, presenting mock apple pie as a clever solution during scarcity. But despite its creativity, the illusion wasn't perfect. The texture, while similar, never fully captured the freshness of real apples. As living standards improved and fruit became more accessible year-round, the need for substitutes like this slowly disappeared. What once felt like a smart workaround began to feel unnecessary, even odd. By the late 20th century, mock apple pie had largely faded from kitchens, surviving mostly as a historical curiosity. Today, it remains a fascinating reminder of how resourceful home cooks once were, able to turn something as simple as crackers into a dessert that tried, and almost succeeded, in becoming something entirely different. It looked like something born from absolute necessity, a dish that belonged to a time when nothing in the pantry was wasted and every meal had to stretch just a little further. Spam upside-down pie emerged during the mid-20th century, especially around the years following the Great Depression and World War II, when canned meats became a dependable staple in American households. At its core, the recipe was simple but unusual. Slices of Spam were arranged at the bottom of a baking dish, often layered with pineapple rings or canned vegetables, then covered with a biscuit or cornbread-like batter. Once baked, the entire dish was flipped upside down, revealing a glossy, caramelized topping that had formed during cooking. The result was both practical and visually striking, a meal that turned inexpensive ingredients into something that felt complete. For families of that era, Spam wasn't a novelty, it was survival food that carried them through uncertain times. Recipes like this reflected a mindset shaped by rationing, frugality, and adaptability. Even sweet elements like pineapple were added to balance the salty richness, creating combinations that would later feel unusual but were once entirely normal. As decades passed and food culture shifted toward freshness, variety, and lighter meals, Spam-based dishes began to lose their place. The idea of building a pie around canned meat slowly faded from everyday cooking, replaced by more modern comfort foods. Today, Spam upside-down pie survives only in old recipe collections and memories passed down from older generations. It stands as a quiet reminder of a time when creativity in the kitchen was not about trends, but about making something filling, warm, and dependable out of whatever was available. It was the kind of dessert that surprised guests before they even took a bite. Pineapple cheese salad was once a familiar sight on American tables from the 1940s through the 1960s, especially at church gatherings, holiday dinners, and family potlucks. At first glance, it looked like a sweet dish, bright pineapple chunks, sometimes folded into gelatin or arranged in a molded shape. But beneath the fruit was a layer of cream cheese, whipped or spread to create a rich, tangy base. In its time, this combination wasn't seen as strange. It reflected a growing fascination with convenience foods and creative presentation. Canned pineapple made fruit available year-round, while cream cheese added a sense of indulgence without requiring much effort. Home cooks often shaped it into molds or layered it in decorative bowls, turning a simple mix into something that looked festive and generous. The contrast was what made it memorable, the sharp sweetness of pineapple against the smooth, slightly salty richness of cheese. For some, it was refreshing. For others, it was an acquired taste that never quite fit into traditional dessert expectations. Still, it appeared on tables again and again, carried by recipe cards and community cookbooks that encouraged experimentation. As culinary trends evolved, the boundaries between savory and sweet became more defined. Fresh salads, lighter desserts, and simpler combinations began to replace heavily processed or molded dishes. Pineapple cheese salad slowly faded, no longer matching the modern idea of what a dessert, or even a salad, should be. Today, it remains a nostalgic relic of mid-century cooking, remembered for its bold pairing and its place in a time when home kitchens were willing to blur every line between flavors, textures, and expectations. And just like that, these once popular Betty Crocker creations faded quietly from American kitchens. What was once considered innovative, comforting, or even essential slowly turned into forgotten pages of cookbooks and fading family memories. Each dish tells a story, not just of food, but of the era that created it, shaped by necessity, creativity, and changing tastes. Some feel strange today, others strangely familiar. But all of them carry a piece of culinary history that time nearly erased. If you've ever seen or heard of any of these dishes, share your memory below, and don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten stories like this.